Здравствуйте, дорогие коллеги. Обращаюсь по-русски, пока нет англоязычных участников. Меня слышно? Скажите, пожалуйста.
Да, слышно. Добрый день, Алексей.
Приветствовать. Угу. Барбаре это, вероятно, Ольга Валерьевна Алиева к нам подключается. Я пока все еще говорю по-русски, это будет англоязычный семинар, но...
я сейчас переименуюсь.
Да, спасибо большое. Нет англоязычных участников, поэтому русский доминирует. Угу. То у Эндрю все в порядке. Да, yes. Okay, Andrew is joining us. Wonderful. We are waiting for his camera to turn on, for his sound, for his audio to turn on.
It says video is on. But for some reason it's taking.
I cannot see you. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm.
Very strange.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's making you implicit.
Touche. Weird. Start and stop video, not working. I'll try leaving and coming back.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're waiting for you. No problem. Так, Эндрю нас покинул на время. Дорогие друзья, давайте я еще кого-нибудь сделаю соорганизатором. На всякий случай, вдруг у меня прервется связь, чтобы все было под контролем. Дарья, можно вас сделать соорганизатором? Вы не против?
Okay, so the sound is there, but for some reason there's no video. It says video is on.
Okay. So we are in no hurry, so you can try it another time, maybe something else. You can reboot your computer if it helps. Oh, perfect. Wonderful. We can see you.
I have no idea why that happened.
It's like a miracle.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so sound's working and video is working.
Okay, so we can don't know. Just a moment. I'm looking into my email through my emails, and I see a request to join this. Yes, very last minute request to join this conversation. Of course, please grant me a moment. I want to answer this potential participant in our conversation. Just a moment. Okay, hope that it will work. Dear friends, we can begin today's seminar, and I remind you that this is the second seminar in a new series of philosophical seminars at our School of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at HSE, where we discuss the most outstanding publications by our faculty members. And I have registered a number of requests from people who would like to join this conversation, this talk, but they just could not make it. And we are making a recording. And I hope that everyone will get their chance to view this conversation. So let me introduce our speaker. It's Andrew Haas, who is associate professor at School of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at HSE. Andrew graduated from Trinity College, from Boston College. He made his PhD at State University of New York at Stony Brook. And he, over the course of his career, he held a number of very prestigious and very interesting academic positions. For example, I took my liberty to go through his CV, and I discovered that at some point Andrew worked with Jacques Derrida in Paris. Today's occasion to talk with Andrew is his recent publication, his 2018 book, Unity and Aspect. I believe that it's better for me to yield the floor to Andrew. So just my last point before I yield the floor. If you ever plunged, tried to read this very rich book, you understand how almost impossible to give a short description or to represent the content of it. But nevertheless, so Andrew, the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you, Alexei. Thank you for organizing this and for inviting me. So I'll try to be brief so that we can then have more time for discussion. Can I share my screen? Can you enable me?
Just a moment, yes, it's important. I want to make you a co-organizer, just in case that I drop out for some technical reasons.
Okay. So I've prepared a little presentation. If I have it like that now, are your photos blocking my text or not?
No.
No, because I need to make it a little bit smaller. So that's, you can see that?
Yes, I can see it.
Yes, okay. So that's the abstract, which I assume you've all at least had a look at. I won't read through it again, but rather I'll let you know that the impetus for this book was a long time in coming. If you looked at the text, at the introduction to the text at all, you'll see it really took me almost 10 years to write. But in many ways, the motivation remains the same, and it remains the same even for today, namely that we note, as Nietzsche said, that the desert is growing. And we see this not only in philosophy, but also in philosophy. We see it also in politics, aesthetics, ethics, global warming, et cetera, all the major issues of today, it seems to me, demonstrate that the desert is continuing to grow. And yet, as Hodelin says, where danger is, grows also saving. So one can hope that there is some possibilities that we have perhaps overlooked that we should look at again. And this drove me to think about where I might look to address these issues. And of course, as Kant says, the battlefield of these endless controversies is called metaphysics. Now, of course, metaphysics has nowadays, if you will, a bad name. I don't really share this view. I don't think we need to attach, if you will, negative connotations to this term just because it's today gotten a bad name. And so I decided to keep it, but to re-articulate it, to think about it differently, to keep the name, but to, if you will, revivify it in some way. And in order to address these issues of the desert growing. So with that said, I thought if I have anything that I can add, something to contribute, because I think at some point in time, as you'll know if you looked at my CV, before 2018, for the most part, I was if you will, a kind of standard Hegel, Heidegger, contemporary European philosophy scholar, etc. But I think at some point in time, as one gets older, one decides that one should at least try to contribute to the discussion what one can, if one can contribute anything. And for me, that meant going back in the history of philosophy to Plato, to the quote that begins Being in Time, which is there in front of us from Plato. For manifestly you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed. And it occurred to me that, well, if this is the question, how can we respond to it? If this is, for Heidegger, at least Heidegger signaled this, is a fundamental question. Because of course Heidegger asks, do we have today an answer to the question of what we actually mean with the word being? Not at all. This made me ask, okay, well, what is the answer to the question, or the response at least, to the question of the meaning of being in the history of philosophy? And what is Heidegger's response? We recall that Aristotle warns us, I quote, "It's not possible that either unity or being should be a single genus of beings. For the differentia of any genus must each of them both have being and be one. But it is not possible for the genus taken apart from its species, any more from the species of the genus, to be predicated of its proper differentia. So that if unity or being is a genus, no differentia will either have being or be one. In other words, being is not a genus." Okay, being is not a genus, and yet being is, it seems, universal. Being is everything that is, whatever it is. Okay, if being is not a universal that is generic, what kind of universal is being? As Heidegger says, as the fundamental theme of philosophy, being is not a genus of beings. yet it pertains to every being. Its universality must be sought in a higher sphere. So Heidegger acknowledges that in the history of philosophy, from the Greeks to Heidegger, being is a universal. But its universality, whatever that means, universal, its universality, the universality of the universal, must be sought in a higher place than that of a genus or species, obviously. Being and its structure are over and beyond every being and every possible existing determination of a being. So this left me perplexed. What is being? As Aristotle says, being is used in various senses, but always with reference to one arche. Some things are said to be because they are ousiai, others because they are modifications of ousia, others because they are process toward ousia, or destructions or privations or qualities of ousia, or productive or generative of ousia, or of terms relating to ousia, or negations of certain of these terms, or of ousia. In other words, it's ousia. So Heidegger marks this. The main term for the being of beings, and we'll leave it untranslated precisely because of what Heidegger says, that is, its definitive interpretation is ousia. Very well. As a philosophical concept, the word means constant presence. This is, if you will, the first of Heidegger's major contributions to the discussion, in my view, of the history of philosophy of being. Namely, that being means presence. But even this fundamental meaning of ousia and the track it lays out for the interpretation of being could not maintain itself. The reinterpretation of ousia as substantia began immediately. This remains current in the Middle Ages and in modernity up to now. So, ousia is primarily now understood as substantia, but as Heidegger points out, this translation is misleading. It should be translated as presence. Plato asks, of course, does the expression is not denote anything other than the absence, apousia, of the presence of what we say that it is not, nothing but. In other words, Plato already understood that ousia, as opposed to apousia, should be understood as presence, not as substance, nor as substantia. This is why Heidegger then, following Plato, says, in fact, humans always remain approached by the presence of something actually present without explicitly heeding presence itself. But we have to do with absence, apousia, just as often, that is, constantly. In other words, it seemed to me that what Heidegger had done in Being and Time and in later texts is he had contributed to the history of philosophy of ontology, that is, metaphysics understood as the question of the meaning of being, by supplementing the understanding of being as presence with the understanding of being as absence. So that being could no longer, or should no longer be understood, certainly not as substantia or substance, nor merely as presence, but just as often as absence. This is a major shift, a major advancement, it seems to me, in the history of philosophy, and that's the first contribution that I saw in Being and Time. Okay, this then drove me to go back to Aristotle, back to the metaphysics, understood as ontology, the study of being qua being, and to reread the metaphysics where Aristotle says, being and unity are the same and of one nature, and unity is nothing other than being. There must be exactly as many kinds of being as of unity. Well, is this what Aristotle does in the metaphysics? In fact, it is. He repeats himself. He repeats everything that he does with being with unity. I quote again, unity is spoken in many ways, exactly as he said about being. Being is spoken in many ways. The term one then has these many senses. What is continuous by nature and the whole, the individual, the universal, all of these are in view of the fact that they are indivisible. To be one means to be indivisible. Okay, so Herewith, Aristotle had both articulated the fact that being and unity are the same and are one nature. In other words, metaphysics could no longer be understood or should no longer be understood as simply ontology, the study of being qua being, but just as much henology, the study of unity qua unity. Now, of course, this term is not very current in Anglo-American discussions of classics or Aristotle, but it's very current and very has a long history in the Francophonic world. I don't know, maybe it's used in the Russian world as well, but it's certainly used in continental European world, henology. And therefore, metaphysics, it seemed to me, had to be understood as ontohenology. But that started me thinking, well, if being was primarily understood as presence, and Heidegger supplemented this with absence, well then, what is the primary understanding of unity? Because it seemed to me that pretty much everybody in the history of philosophy who was talking about unity was not thinking of it in the way that Aristotle thought of it, because Aristotle says to be one means to be indivisible. So the primary understanding of unity for Aristotle, for metaphysics, is indivisibility. But of course, the other of indivisibility is divisibility, just as the other of ousia is apousia. Adiaretaton is what the adiaretos is, what the indivisible is. So the diaretos would also be another, if you will, modification of unity, the other of unity, just as absence could be understood as the other of presence. And so now we have, if you will, a fuller understanding of metaphysics, if we understand it as the study of being in unity, that is the study of being as presence and absence, and the study of unity as divisibility and indivisibility. Of course, we're not done. This drove me to take the next step, to go back to Heidegger and to ask, well, why is being in time about being in time? I quote, "From the dawn of Western European thinking until today, being means the same as present. Out of presencing, presence speaks the present. According to current representations, the present, together with past and future, forms the character of time. Being is determined as presence by time. Everything has its time. Aha, so time is just as universal as being. But being is not a thing, is not in time, yet being as presence remains determined by time, by what is temporal." So time is just as universal for Heidegger as being, and therefore just as universal as unity. Okay, what is time? First of all, Heidegger affirms that the universality of time is not exceeded by anything that is so-called out of time. Right? There are interpretations of Aristotle, which Heidegger disagrees with, that claim that God, the gods, et cetera, are out of time. As Heidegger says, the atemporal and the supratemporal are also temporal with respect to their being. In other words, being atemporal, supratemporal, are also ways of being temporal. How? At all times. Omnitemporal, sempiternitas. That's why Heidegger says time does not have the kind of being of any other thing. Rather, time temporalizes and temporalizes beings out of the temporality of time. Why? Because time does the same to temporal beings that being does to temporal beings. Being allows beings to come to presence. Time allows temporal beings to be present now, then, in the future, et cetera, et cetera. That's why Heidegger says time is the how of being. And because it's the how of being, it's also the how of beings. And because being and unity are the same and one thing and apply one another as principle and cause, therefore, time is also the third, if you will, universal. We'll keep that term for the time being, if you will, that Heidegger has if you will, uncovered or discovered. So what then is this being, which has its universality and is as universal as unity and time? Being is, as we know from Levinas, a verb. Normally, I quote, one speaks of the word being as if it were a substantive, as if it were a being, a noun, even though it is par excellence a verb. In French, one says the being or a being. With Heidegger, the word being was revealed in its verbality. Philosophy would thus have been, even when it was not aware of it, an attempt to answer the question of the meaning of being qua verb. This is exactly what Heidegger says. Being as a substantive came from the verb. It was dirempted out of, abstracted out of, constituted out of the verb, because it's the very verbality of the verb to be that is the origin of being qua noun, and therefore being understood as a being in the history of philosophy, whether one understands being as idea, substance, gods, God, cogito. I'm just running through the history of philosophy of being qua being, understood as a being, reason, spirit, will to power, etc., etc. Plato already knew this. By verb, we mean an expression which is applied to actions. And as Aristotle said, a verb is that which, in addition to its proper meaning, carries with it the notion of time. So, if being is a verb, and it's the verbality of the verb to be, because being is a way of doing, of acting. It's what is done. Then this verb will have all the attributes of any verb, namely, it will have time. As it does, it will be temporally constituted. And we can always make it into a being, but we would not actually grasp what it means to be if we turned being, and our own being, for example, into a substantive. Rather, we need to hold on to being and its verbality, which of course correlates, if you will, or has its other in unity and in time. We see this in language. Heidegger's example. The German term for verb, and of course being is a verb, first and foremost, because the substantive came out of the verb. The German term for verb, Zeitwort, aha, right, time word, may be closer to including the category of time in the essence of the parts of speech here in question. So the German for Heidegger reveals the verbal character of the verb to be, being qua verb. But as we know, those of us who study Greek and many other languages, Russian included, verbs do not only have tense or time. They have something else. In grammar, they call it aspect, vili. Hansen and Quinn in their Greek text given the example. We fell, we were falling, or we used to fall. We had fallen. These verbal expressions are the same in person, number, and tense, but they differ in aspect. So it seemed to me that this was the clue that we had to take up. So I went back and I started looking at the history of the grammar that Heidegger cites in Being and Time, and he cites both Brugmann and Halbisch. So here's something from Brugmann. Aspect is, in contradistinction to tense, how the action of the verb is done. Well, we recall, we just heard from Heidegger that time is the how of being. So aspect, now we learn, in contradistinction to time or tense, is the how the action of the verb is done. But being is a verb, and therefore being has to have both time and aspect, as does unity. And let's not forget, time and aspect also are as well. And they are one. because anything that is one, if it is. Herbisch. First of all, it's wrong to posit aspects as attributes of chronos, time, of grammatical tenses, although we are unable to separate the tenses, the tempora, for example, from the essence of the verb. Originally, tense and aspect constitute a unified whole, the question of which is older and whether one can be derived from the other are wrongly posed. This, of course, is what some thinkers try to do, is they try to derive one from the other, do away with one or the other. The clue remained, unfortunately, unnoticed for a long time. So Herbisch understood that there's a clue here that remained unnoticed, aspect. So just as everything that was said of being, it seems to me, had to be said of unity, as Aristotle reminds us, everything that's said of time needs to be said of aspect. Aspect bears on inherent features of the verb, and hence is universal by definition. So if time is universal, so too is aspect. Why? Because they bear on everything with respect to the verb. Which verb? Being. And being and unity imply one another. Plato recognizes this, and so do other Greeks, everybody who writes in Greek. He gives the example at the beginning of the Ion. So, and were you competing? Ego nizu, and did you compete? Ego niso. Dostoevsky recognizes the exact same phenomenon, and you're all well aware of this because Russian is a much more aspectual language than it is a temporal one, while German and most European languages are much more temporal or tense-based. Russian and many, many other languages, not only Greek, but most, in fact, non-Indo-European languages are much more aspectual than temporal. Dostoevsky writes in The Idiot, oh, you may be sure that Columbus was happy not when he had discovered Открыл America, but when he was discovering Открывал it. So we're aware that here, of course, they're both in the same time, right? Both in the past tense or time, and yet they have an aspectual difference. What does aspect mean, therefore? It's the way in which, the how of the verb at any time whatsoever. And therefore, if we're going to understand the verb, the verbality of the verb, we need to understand both the tense or time and the aspect. We cannot suffice ourselves with just one or the other. Okay. I've said a lot of things, but we still have not clarified, if you will, the meaning of being. Because being has to, if you will, as Heidegger says, allow for beings to come to presence. Right? Just as time temporalizes, being presences or brings to presence, allows beings to be present. Okay, so what then is being? Let's go back to the beginning. Aristotle says being and unity are the same. We know this because everything that is said about being has to be said about unity. There are just as many meanings of being as there are of unity. Presence and absence for being. Divisibility and indivisibility for unity. But they're the same. Okay, they're the same, but we don't understand how they're the same because they sound different. Being, insofar as it is understood as presence and absence, sounds quite different from unity understood as divisibility and indivisibility. I'll bracket out the meanings of time and aspect or the determinations of time and aspect for the time being, just to concentrate on being and unity, because Aristotle says being and unity are the same and are of one nature in the sense that they are implied by one another. Bon voilà. Now we understand how being and unity relate to one another, and therefore how they relate to beings and units or unities to things. They are implied, that is, by implication. Okay, good. I'm saying to myself now, right, as I'm thinking through this whole process, very good. What does that mean? What does implication mean? Because it can't mean presence. Implication of being implied cannot be a way of being present, because it has to take account both of presence and of absence if it's going to be the meaning of being. And it's got to take account both of indivisibility and divisibility if it's going to be the meaning of unity. And it can't be any of the meanings of being or any of the meanings of unity, but has to be something else. So what could implication mean if it's not to fall into one side of presence or absence? Because what is implied cannot merely come to presence and cannot merely stay in absence, or some combination or permutation of the two. We need something else that would allow them both to constitute themselves as presence and absence. And here it seemed to me, once again, going back to Greek, but as I'm going to demonstrate, one sees this in many languages, that to imply could have another meaning, namely precisely that which neither came to presence nor remained in absence, but was merely implied, a third thing, a third way. In other words, because it had to be the how in which being and unity were the same and of one nature. It had to be how being and unity are in things. But being couldn't be in a being by being present in it, or absent from it, or some combination or permutation of the two. But it had to be something else, something other. So what could implication be? How could it be, if you will, such that it did not fall into presence or absence? In Greek, and as we'll see in all these examples, being can be spoken in a way that it does not come to presence nor remain in absence. Homer writes, the rule of many is not good. Uk agathon polu koirania. But we see here that although it's translated as the rule of many is not good, it does not have the verb to be. Ine is not there. Uk agathon, very bad. Polu koirania, the rule of many. So the rule of many is, not there. Uk agathon. Heraclitus. And I started seeing these all over the place. This is called nominal sentences, by the way, for the grammatical whizzes in the room. Man's character is his fate, is the normal English translation of this. Ethos anthropodaimon. Ethos, character, anthropo, of humans, of us, daimon, is our fate, is daimonic. Ethos anthropo is not there. Okay, it's not there, but it's not that it's not there completely. It's not that it's absent, but it's not present either. It's implied. A one is one, if a one is one. This is hen in Plato. Diogenes, this is more Greek. It's all over the Greek. This is what I started to see. It's all over the Greek. It's in the Latin as well. Cicero, everything precious is rare. Omnia preclara rara. Omnia preclara, everything precious is, no being. It's not that it's absent nor present, it's implied. In Hegel, when it comes time for Hegel to articulate the absolute essence of the phenomenology of spirit, the central thesis upon which the entire phenomenology of spirit is built, namely the speculative sentence. He says, okay, here's the example of the speculative sentence I'm going to give. God is being, the predicate is being. Gott ist das Sein, das Prädikat, das Sein. Whoops. Right there, where being should be, it's implied. We say this obviously in Russian, you say it every day, whenever you use the present tense, right? Ya amerikaniec, or when Dostoevsky says, ya человек больной, ya zlой человек, he's saying, I sick man. The problem is that all the translations of this into English, into many languages that use being, violate, if you will, the way in which being is spoken, the way in which being, if you will, is. Being is implied. Wittgenstein recognizes this because he tried to learn Russian, and he sees it in Russian, right? When he says, in Russian, one says, stone red, Steinrot, instead of the stone is red. But for all you Wittgensteinians out there, that's it. That's the end of his discussion of implied being in Russian. Very disappointing. And final example, and probably the most famous line of English poetry from Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, the very last line, being is truth, truth, there it is, implied being, truth, beauty. So, in many ways, that is central to unity and aspect. Because once being is implied, then we understand that not only is being implied, but if being and unity are the same and one thing, insofar as they imply one another as principle and cause, then unity is implied too, and time, and aspect. Because implication is the way in which being, unity, time, and aspect are in beings, and that which allows being, unity, time, and aspect themselves to be and to be one. So I decided I needed to make this more concrete because obviously it sounds probably pretty abstract. So I decided I would look at that being whose being is an issue for it, according to Heidegger, namely us. And what I saw, of course, in Heidegger and Being in Time and elsewhere is a discussion of us as Dasein, which clearly has a privilege that is accorded to being, Dasein. However, what we found is that the privilege accorded to being is, if you will, lopsided, because we need to give privilege just as much to unity as to being, and just as much to time and to aspect. And therefore, I had to go back to the history of philosophy and find another way of thinking about us, not as Dasein, but what I discovered when I went back to the history of philosophy and the history of literature was that there was another word that the Greeks had used for us, namely phos. And when you start looking at Greek literature, and you find this all over the place. I quote from Homer, then among them uprose also Menelaus, sore vexed at heart, furiously wroth at Antilochus, and a herald gave the staff into his hand and proclaimed silence among the Argives, and thereafter spoke among them the godlike man. Isotheos phos. And we see here the word is not anthropos, but phos. And so I took this term phos and used that as the word for us, but the word that was not simply anthropos, which is the standard word in the history of thinking about us as human and our humanity. And I certainly couldn't use Dasein any longer. But this seemed to me to be a word that articulated, in some sense, our way of, because phos means light as well, obviously different accent, but it's a homonym for light. And therefore, it seemed to me that we could use this word to articulate our way of illuminating everything that is, being, unity, time, aspect, ourselves, the world. Pindar says the same. Without falling himself, he threw men, photas, by nimble shifting feints and left through the ring of spectators to noisy shouts, etc. Parmenides says exactly the same, right? The mares that carry me as far as autumn might go were bringing me onward, after having led me and set me down on the divinity's many-worded road, which carries through all the towns the man who knows. Edota phota. This is why Plutarch sums it up. The ancients called man, anthropon, phota. In other words, phos. So, why? Because phos articulates our way of illuminating, of being illuminating, of being one as illuminating, temporally and aspectually. And so all the other things that we do, whether in science, in ethics, in art, thinking, knowing, doing, judging, acting, speaking, all of those are ways of illuminating. Because that's what phos does, if you will, most originally. And so the rest of the text is an attempt to work out the way in which being, unity, time, and aspect are implied by phos. That's it. I can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I turned my mic off. So how are we supposed to celebrate perfect presentation in Zoom? Should we applaud?
That's perfectly okay.
Okay, so now it's Q&A time. I believe that by now everyone can use the chat room. So if you have a question, please write there something so that I see I function as a moderator so that I see that you have a question and I can give you this opportunity. Olga Liva, please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. I very much sympathize with your attention to the spectral mode of the Greek language, and I think that the Greeks themselves were very sensitive of that too. One needs only to remember how Aristotle says that things indivisible cannot move, but they can have moved. And he feels this difference between aspect and the entity he describes. But however, I have two small comments, maybe not so much about ontohenology or something like that, but more about the Greek language. Because, well, the first thing, I'm not sure that you can say that force is light and force is man is the same thing. And even etymologically, I mean, there are two entries in the etymological dictionary and in any dictionary. And I'm not sure there's any connection between them. That's the first thing. And I just wanted you to comment a little bit on it. The second thing, I wondered if we can return to this slide with implications, if possible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
This one?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Mm.
I'm just thinking. You said, if I recall this correctly, you said that these are nominal sentences, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure that that's a description I would give, because a nominal sentence is a sentence where you cannot you cannot integrate a verb into it, right? And here we can think of a copula omitted, and in fact you can find examples in the Greek language when similar phrases, you have a nominal part of the predicate, and there is a copula in it. So why is it that important that there is just no copula in these examples, whereas in many others we do have it? For example, in the beginning of the Philebus, Socrates says, "Hosos nous ukestiagaton." Is there any difference between having a sentence with st or without st? So that's probably a very grammatical question. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll address the second question first. It's actually, the Greek grammar is not important for me here, or is not as important as the concept of implication. I was just trying to work out how we can think about implication without falling into a philosophy of presence or absence, or some combination or permutation thereof. And so it doesn't really matter to me whether or not they're all, strictly speaking, nominal sentences or not. What matters to me is, how can we think about implication? So, I mean, these are just sentences which give examples of implication. You can have implication in signs, right? The example I give in Unity and Aspect is a candle in the window, or the example that Heidegger gives is a knot in the handkerchief, right? Any of these kinds of things, these phenomenon that embody a way of thinking and acting that are irreducible to presence and absence. Because it seems to me that that's the way in which being is. That's how we can understand how being could be in a way that's neither present nor absent. And that then opens up solutions to a whole range of problems, right? How are ideas in things for Plato? What is the meaning of participation? What's the relation between universals and particulars? By implication. How are the dead not simply dead and gone, absent, nor merely here as living beings present, by implication? And so this third way of being, and these are merely, if you will, sentences that give examples of that. So if this doesn't help you to grasp the meaning of being as implication, that's fine, you could ignore this. But it does seem to me that being is implied in language in a way that one could understand it without going into, say, presence and absence. That's what I'm looking for.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Just, I was thinking of this sentence from Aristotle.
Mm.
It's a little bit difficult to judge without the Greek, but I think that I've always thought that what he means is that to be one implies to be, and to be implies to be one, and you cannot, take one without the other.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you give a slightly different picture of this idea.
You're absolutely right. Here, what he means something else here, right? Here it's akaluthein here. Here he means they necessarily imply one another. That you can't be without being one, and anything that is one also is. But this was, if you will, a clue to me to look for what implication, what could otherwise mean. Not merely necessarily follows from the other, but rather this way of speaking that neither brings to presence nor leaves in absence. For example, Grice's example is, Alexei, did you choose that shirt yourself? In other words, I'm implying that's an ugly shirt.
Are you?
No. This is Grice's example, right? Did you choose that shirt yourself, right? And, you know, I don't want to say what I mean. In other words, I don't want to bring my meaning to presence. I don't want it to be present, but I don't want it to be absent either, right? At the, you know, at Comey's hearing in Congress, he used the example of King George, I believe, of England, when he said, "Who will rid me of this meddlesome priest?" And King George was not calling on his, you know, followers to necessarily kill the priest, nor not to kill the priest. He wasn't saying one or the other. In other words, his meaning was not present in the words that he said. So when Trump said to Comey, "Can you see your way to letting this thing with Flynn go?" his meaning was not present, but nor was it absent. And so it's this third way of being, this way of meaning, of implying what is neither present nor absent. So Olga, if you, as I said, if you don't like the examples in the sentence, you can think of examples in meaning, in signs, in actions, et cetera, et cetera. This is what I'm trying to get at. And so this is, you're absolutely right. This implication here means that being and unity follow from one another necessarily. Nothing is if it is not one, and unity is as well. And so too with time and aspect. But here, implication in all these examples and the example I just gave of meaning, the example from Grice, etc., there implication means neither present nor absent. And so it seemed to me, if I could understand implication as neither present nor absent, I could go back to these sentences and understand the way in which being is in these sentences is neither that it is present in them nor absent from them. Just briefly then to go back to your question about Phos, I just published an article in Sophia called Phos, Our Other Greek Name. And so I don't need to go over that article and its thesis more than simply refer you to that. I can send you a copy if you want. It's on. And that's where I make the argument that although you're right that they're not the same word, it seems to me there's ample evidence, both etymological and in terms of the history of Greek thinking, to argue that they're intimately connected.
Okay, thank you. I'll have a look then.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. We have some more questions. So Ruslan has two questions. Please go ahead with your first question, and then we will let other people to ask their questions.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for your report, for your speaking. in my opinion, it's a very interesting theme for discussing concerning being and other metaphysics topics. Yes, I have two questions for you. My first question is how would you describe modern situation of desertification in Western politics?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that Western politics, like the Western world, Western culture, et cetera, is dominated by a philosophy of presence and absence. It seems to me it's reductive to think of the philosophy of presence as the only way of thinking about politics or culture, et cetera. And there's been a lot of work done, I think, trying to supplement the philosophy of presence with the philosophy of absence. But I think this is a mistake because it merely articulates, if you will, the other of the philosophy of presence, which belongs to it and has belonged to it for the entire history of philosophy. And therefore, if one were trying, it seems to me, to develop a politics that did not fall into the philosophy of presence and absence, but rather understood that we needed to reconsider the way in which implication functioned in politics, then we would have a very different way of thinking about the political, however you understand the political. So, you know, take your favorite political philosopher, go through and look at the moments at which they articulate a philosophy of presence and absence. And that's where it seems to me you will find the limit of their way of thinking about things, whether it's power, citizenship, freedom, et cetera, and that which falls outside their discourse would be implication, because implication is precisely that which cannot come to presence. So, I mean, obviously this would be a separate talk. We would have to look at very specific kinds of very specific political philosophers, political philosophy, and get into it that way. But it does seem to me that the desertification in politics, and we can't only think about Western politics anymore, but world politics, because we're talking about the desertification of the world now, is occurring, if you will, in concert with, if not determined by, the philosophy of presence and absence.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, to put it in Heideggerian terms, in terms of the forgetting of implication.
Okay, I understand your point, but there is a main problem. Western politics and Western world is not whole, is not entire world. For instance, there is Russia, there is Asia, there are different cultures and different philosophical styles. And concerning your examples, for example, Plato, like philosopher and politician, Aristotle, like philosopher and politician, and even Martin Heidegger, like political philosopher. It's not same thing because 20th cycle is not ancient world. Ancient world is a world where there are ethics and politics, and in my opinion, that 2 points are main line of lifestyle. And concerning our world is very technocratical world, and concerning your differences between being like presence and being like absence, in my opinion, presence is is not chosen, but absence is choice is a choice of acting and speaking and different building of lifestyle. But it's my point of view. Maybe
yes, Ruslan, please. Please ask your question. So
yes,
actually,
yes,
already
okay,
you are explaining already your own theory, and we will have another time for that.
Yes, and my second question, if being
I'm sorry. Before you ask your second question, let us give a chance for other participants to ask their questions. Anyone? Okay. If nobody else, then actually then I take my turn. Actually, last time. When I was announcing your talk, I mean in this seminar, I said ahead of time that it's going to be something connected to Heidegger, because the first time we had a talk by Alexander Mikhailovsky on Heidegger, and but then I opened your book, and I had to turn on a search engine to find the first mention of Heidegger, because actually it began very lately, and in general, I was surprised another time today when you presented your representation of your book, and it was very consistent, it was very explicit, almost affirmative. And I just want everyone who have not looked so far in the book, go and look into the book, because you will get immediately what I mean. And actually, that was reflected in the review, also shared with everyone, where the reviewer said that actually noticed that there is no sentence in this book. It's 300 pages. There is no sentence in this book which is assertive sentence, declarative sentence. Every sentence in this 300 pages long book is with some qualifier. It doesn't say that this is so. It says it might be so, or probably, or perhaps, or something like that. So there is no assertion, not single assertion over these 300 pages. And of course, by now everyone understands that it's connected to this idea of being as implication. But in contrast to what you can find in Andrew's book, in his oral presentation, he was very assertive, and that was striking for me. At some point, when you mentioned German linguists of 19th century, Sprachwissenschaftler, such as Gustav Herbisch and Karl Brugmann, it began to feel like you want to give us certain definitive proof that being is implication. And this is just a very striking contrast. I cannot square it in my head. So how the entire structure of your book, which is against affirmative, against assertion, is converted in your oral presentation into something like an argument in favor of this particular thesis that being is implication. This is my first question. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. The answer is partly personal and partly philosophical. On a personal note, I found that I had to, in order to write the book, suspend certain academic scholarly norms for myself. So one of them is assertion. If you look at the article that I published in Horizon on what is a problem, there you'll see a kind of scholarly argument for the problematic in Kant against the esoteric, the apodictic and the esoteric modes in the table of judgments. And so I tried to write a book that reflected that. But on the personal note, I felt that I had to suspend these scholarly norms in order to allow myself to think and write. And so that's what I did. You're absolutely right. There's no unqualified sentences, because that also philosophically allowed me to keep what I was saying, the thesis, if you will, the meaning, in suspense, in suspension. And that's because it seemed to me, to go back to the philosophical answer, if one looks at implication and tries to understand what we mean by implication, by merely implying what it is that makes implication the how of being, it's that it is in suspense, that is in suspension. Or with respect to the examples I gave of meaning, that the meaning, the sense of what is being said by a given sentence, like who will rid me of this meddlesome priest, is that the meaning continues to be in suspense for the time being until it comes down, until it comes to presence. And so there's this continuous, especially continuous or incomplete way of being that keeps the sense of meaning in suspense. And so I tried to do that in this text, to write in that fashion. Now, I recognize that that is not traditional philosophical scholarship. And if you look at the text, you will see that there are no footnotes, for example. Right? There are no citations. All of that just is lumped together at the end in an appendix, basically. So part of this was personal. I had to bracket out all of my philosophical training, everything that I had done before, in order to make a kind of break and suspend that way of thinking and writing in order to do the work, to allow myself to do the work. So, I mean, that's the personal answer, and the philosophical answer is that I think that it suits this way of trying to think in suspense, in suspension, and to write that way and speak that way.
Okay, but so that I understand, unlike Jacques Derrida, who would say that actually there is no way you can make assertions, your point is rather different, that you have to make things in suspense up until the time. And then the time comes, you come out with a declarative sentence, with the assertion. So there is, and this is the difference from Jacques Derrida, that for him, that would never come to an assertion. And for you, it comes in the end, but the important part is the suspense before the resolution.
I agree with what you said about me. I'm not sure I agree with what you said about Derrida, because I'm not sure he would say that there is no assertion, but rather that there is an assertion, and the assertion is always already deconstructible. So there are judgments. We do come to judgments, but they're problematic. They throw themselves up again. They call themselves into question again. So, I mean,
is this how we are to understand your assertion in the end that being is implication, that it's deconstructible?
Sure. I mean, everything is deconstructible for Derrida. Sure. I mean, he could deconstruct this text Absolutely. But it would also resist it. It would resist it by the suspense or the suspension of implication, because you can only deconstruct what comes to presence.
The final one. So, is it a proof? Your oral presentation today, is it a proof, a consistent argument in favor of certain thesis that being is implication, or not, or this is a judgment in sense of Derrida, which is okay. We come to judgments, but they are all deconstructible.
Well, I thought that within the context of this talk, an academic talk, that one should follow some of the norms of academia and so present things in a way that is assertoric or apodictic. And so I did that.
Okay.
That doesn't really in any way, I think, undercut the way of writing in Unity and Aspect. I could have given a talk like that as well, but without any warning, I thought it might be too violent.
It was for me when I started reading your book.
Okay. Well, good. Then, the book had its intended, impact on you insofar as you had this experience of perhaps, I guess, the norms that you expected from a philosophy book being suspended, being called into question.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? Ruslan has his second question, and if there are no other other question, please ask your question, Ruslan. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Yes, my second question, if being is something indivisible, how can we understanding separate meanings in different philosophy styles? For example, in your report, special was said about Heidegger, Plato, Aristotle, Levinas, Dostoevsky, and so on. I'm interested in your interpretation and your understanding these difficult points.
Okay. First of all, being is not just indivisible.
Okay.
Right? It's both indivisible and divisible.
Yes.
Because that's what it means for being to be one. Now, at the same time, you're absolutely right that different philosophers can and have understood being and unity in different ways. But my claim is that all of these different ways of understanding being actually are determinations of one, to put it in traditional terms, fundamental, essential, original understanding of being as implication, to be assertive, as Alexei called for. And because being is implication, it's out of being's way of being implied that one could and has in the history of philosophy brought being to presence in these various ways, as Plato did, Aristotle, Heidegger, Levinas, etc., etc. But all of them ultimately, pros hen, refer back to and are grounded upon being as implication, the unity of being.
Okay, but unity and being are not simple thing because I can understand unity like world, for example, and being I can I can understand for yourself and interfere my interpretation for other people, like for me presence is being, and in our world being is divisible because I am a particular man, for example, your particular man, and so on, and and there is a question, how can we understand this problem if we tell me I understand being like something indivisible, or I don't understand your point. Apologize me if I don't.
No, that's fine. My point is, first of all, it doesn't matter what you think about being or I think about being. This is not a subjective question, right? My question is, if being is both divisible, as you just said, there's your being and my being, etc., and also indivisible, namely that your coming to presence in your way and my coming to presence in my way are both ways of coming to presence, and therefore presence is the indivisible or essence unity of being. How is this possible? Only if there is a third thing that is neither presence nor absence, neither divisibility nor indivisibility, that allows being to come to presence as divisible or indivisible and indivisible, so that being can show itself, come to presence, both as divisible and indivisible. Only if there's pros hen, a more original understanding of being, that's implication. That is, its way of being, that is prior to coming to presence as divisible or as indivisible.
Yes, not ordinary style. Thank you. Divisible and indivisible. Thank you very much.
Yep, sure.
Okay, dear colleagues, I have a couple more questions, but I want to let other people ask their questions. Okay, then. So, Andrew, I want to press you for a moment on your to clarify your position within the Western philosophical tradition, because as I see it, obviously you rather belong to the European continental school of philosophy, of contemporary philosophy, and you call the analytical philosophy the metaphysical of presence, something like that. But as I see it also, that you have some issues and some differences with such figures as Jacques Derrida or Martin Heidegger. And can you clarify your position toward Derrida and Heidegger? And maybe also, if it's appropriate, to explain what do you mean that you say it's from your appendix where you talk about metaphysics and Greeks and the Greeks, and you asked questions like, is philosophy Greek, or what is to do, what does it mean to do metaphysics? Maybe it's just to do what the Greeks did. So can you clarify how do you see your own position within the contemporary philosophy, especially, and actually it's very good that I very appropriate that I recalled it, because you have certain doubts about contemporary philosophers. Also from your appendix, you ask this question, if there are any contemporary philosophers of notice. Please.
Yeah, that's probably a bit glib. I agree. I apologize for that comment. That was probably said in passion or written in passion. That's why it's in the appendix and not in the body of the text. No, I mean, I think that Heidegger and Derrida both articulate a version of the philosophy of presence and absence. And so are certainly, if you will, able to contribute a, more, a fuller understanding of, say, being and of philosophical reflection than those thinkers who remain within the philosophy of presence and see absence merely as privative. So, I guess in that respect, I don't see either of them understanding implication in the way that I tried to in unity and aspect. They both understand implication, if they understand it at all, in terms of presence and absence, not as neither presence nor absence, but rather a third thing, this way of being in suspense or suspension. So this is where I part company with both of them. And so, you know, for a thinker like Derrida, for example, you know, this way of being, even if it is something like implication, is always understood, if not in terms of presence and absence, in terms of the impossibility of presence, or the impossibility of presence and absence. And so Derrida once again resorts to this kind of presence, if you will, kind of assertion about the, you know, the impossibility of thinking that which doesn't come to presence, cannot come to presence. And so this is the way I see what I'm trying to do in unity and aspect as differing from both Heidegger and Derrida, insofar as it does take implication as neither presence nor absence, seriously.
Okay, so that I understand. So analytic philosophy is philosophy of presence, metaphysics of presence, and Heidegger and Derrida, in your interpretation, are metaphysics of absence.
Presence and absence.
Presence and absence.
Yeah.
So they don't simply negate what is done in the analytical philosophy. They kind of have both perspectives in view, absence and presence.
Yeah.
Okay, and so your path in philosophy is a development, starting from Derrida and Heidegger, a development of philosophy, a metaphysics of implication. So this is a step in the development of the Euro-continental philosophy.
Yeah.
And because my first impression when you were explaining, you were answering the question, was probably wrong, because I pictured it myself that analytical philosophy is a philosophy of metaphysics of presence, and continental philosophy is metaphysics of absence, aletheia, concealment, something like that, absence. And then you, and by combining and overcoming this division, you are able to perform a part of mediator between the two branches of the contemporary philosophy. But as I see it now, you don't have this in mind. So this is not what you want to achieve. You rather want to develop further the continental philosophy, the continental style. Style's not a good word, but
yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Okay, and then what about the Greeks? Do you turn to them for inspiration? Do you have something to learn from them, or it's just your speech?
No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, obviously in unity and aspect, I turn to them for inspiration, for the clues or the hints to the discovery of the meaning of being, that being and unity imply one another, that all verbs have time and aspect, and therefore, if being is a verb, then time and aspect are just as universal as being and unity. This all comes from the Greeks. The importance of time, Heidegger took from the Greeks, so I take it from Heidegger, but ultimately that goes back to the Greeks. And this notion of implication, I think, is clear in the Greek language. So when I found it personally in the Greeks, but one can find it elsewhere as well, but that's where I found it, at least in this text. and the notion of phos from the Greeks. And so therefore a whole other understanding of ourselves. So, I mean, for me, that all comes from the Greeks. But that doesn't make it Greek.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, insofar as they're interested in universals, that doesn't, limit what they said about, say, being to, the fact that it was Greek or it was said in Greece or that it was said in Greek. And so they're not, limited by that, or determined by their Greekness insofar as they're seeking universals. And that's why I began with the desertification of, the planet, right? Because there's no one's getting off the planet. And so it's precisely, with these universal questions that I think philosophy can have something to offer.
Yes, thank you very much. So I have a few more questions, if I may, but I also want to let other people participate. Any other questions, dear colleagues? Because I actually have 2 pages with questions. Okay, my question is, when you explained, there was this slide where you explained what you mean by being as implication, and you focused during this explanation on a particular use, grammatical use of the verb to be as copula.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that actually that was a subject of famous dispute between Rudolf Carnap and Martin Heidegger, which use of being, of the word to be, is more interesting for philosophy. And it was Carnap who insisted that copula is the way we have to use, we shall use the word to be in meaningful sentences. Otherwise, it becomes too Heideggerian, too metaphysical. And on the other hand, it was Heidegger who insisted that actually existential use of the word to be, as in the sentence, it exists, where it's not a copula. This way is more interesting for philosophy. And I'm just curious because if you, as you say, are coming from Heidegger, from building on Heideggerian philosophy, then in this particular point, you side rather with Carnap, not with Heidegger. Because so your argument is is built on this particular usage of the verb to be as copula.
I would say probably neither Heidegger nor Carnap on being, but rather pros hen, that original unity from which these different ways of understanding being are derived. So I don't think that either Heidegger nor Carnap have, I mean, to put it esoterically, grasped the meaning of being, the essential or original meaning of being, which is its way of being, not what it is, but its way of being. And that is implication, implied. That's how it can be presence or a being or copula, or take on any of the other senses. For example, Brentano has 4 senses that Aristotle used being, any of the other senses, essence, existence, etc., all of these ways of understanding being, for me, come out of being qua implication.
Okay, then. You see, especially because you made a reference to certain features of the Russian language where we regularly omit the copula. So I just have to, I cannot help myself but asking, but what is so interesting about implication? Because as a regular Russian person, I use it every day and doesn't find any particular interest in omitting copula in almost every sentence I use.
You may recall that Derrida gave a seminar on Poe's short story, The Purloined Letter. And in that short story, which I'm sure you recall, the solution to where the letter is, Inspector Dupin finds the letter right in front of his face, turned inside out like a glove, hanging right in front of his face. So I would say that those things that are most common in your speaking of Russian may be, in some sense, most profound, if you look at it in the right way. Now, maybe I place too much emphasis in my talk on language and the copula being implied, or being implied, the way that being is implied in present tense Russian. But I think this is in some sense just a clue or a hint, a suggestion. And those are three terms that are absolutely essential for unity and aspect as well, because the clue or the hint is of that which is not present. Right? If I give a hint or a suggestion, or there's a clue to something, it refers to something that is not there. It is not present, nor is it absent. And so the clue, the hint, the suggestion has this structure of implication as well. Language is, for me, a clue or hint, or suggests a way of thinking about the meaning of being. That's all. So if language doesn't help you think about the meaning of being, or the Russian present tense doesn't help you, that's fine. I found it helpful because it made graphic, if you will, that being was not there to be seen, and yet had force in the sentence, copulative force, by binding the subject to the predicate. So being's way of being in these kind of nominal sentences, like Russian present tense, demonstrate being's way of being. It's not there, but it's not there. And this phenomenon, which language gives is just one example, was for me quite revelatory. You know.
Daria, please go ahead with your question.
Just a moment. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Alexei, for this interesting seminar. I'm sorry if the question has been already posed. I was slightly distracted by other seminars here. The question would be, in case of implication, it's clearly we should have already notion of presence and absence, because in order to understand implication, we have to understand how something can be not present and be present at the same time. So how could we take implication to be something primary instead of secondary? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess one can understand it that way, but if it's secondary, it doesn't solve for me the problem of the relation of presence and absence. It doesn't solve the question of the meaning of being. It simply leaves us with presence and absence. And this is what Heidegger tried to address, and Aristotle, and so what I'm trying to address as well. And so it seems to me that if implication is understood not as some permutation or combination of presence and absence, but rather as primary, as prior to presence and absence, well, that then does address the way in which being can come to presence and or go out into absence, and beings as well.
Oh, thank you. I suppose in this case, we cannot even determine implication in these terms. I mean, if we should take implication as something prior to any distinction, in which distinction between present and absence and relation between presence and absence can be grounded.
Yeah.
I mean, in any case, it's difficult to grasp how can we even understand implication then.
Yes, absolutely. That's why at the end of Unity and Aspect, I talk about suspense and suspension. The suspense, for example, of waiting. That which has incomplete or continuous aspect. And it's that way of being, it seems to me, that gives us some kind of experience and some way of determining what implication could be if it's not to be understood in terms of presence and absence. In other words, we would have to think of it in terms of suspension.
Okay, thank you. Alexei, may I have a second question here?
Yes.
I was wondering about how could you relate your conception to Jean-Luc Marion? I should confess I recall very vaguely his ideas, but I remember it was something about being present by being absent, for example, by God, who is not present actually, but still being like negatively conceived God is still present in some sense.
Yeah. I mean, in God Without Being, I think Marion shows his hand. In many ways, he is a philosopher of absence. My argument here, to put it in esoteric terms, as Alexei said, is that that entire way of thinking is merely the other of the philosophy of presence, and therefore belongs to the same tradition. And I don't find it very fulfilling to think about God in terms of presence or absence. This is the problem I have with Levinas as well, right? Because and I think Marion is taking off from Levinas when he thinks of God as this absolute other, this absolute absence, this kind of one-sidedness. It seems to me that he misses this third thing, this third way of being that is neither present nor absent. And therefore, you're absolutely right, Dalia. It can't be explained or understood or experienced in terms of presence and absence, but rather in this third way of suspense. And so, in that sense, I disagree with Marion, in his way of thinking about God or the divine in terms of absence.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, if I may, if there are no other questions. Still, I asked you so to explain how implication can be interesting, and your answer basically referred to things like hints, actually it reminded me of the way Heidegger discussed language in, for example, his works on Hölderlin, where he said that unlike that language of explicit, and now I use your terminology, not his, but that I think is appropriate here. So I like, unlike that language of explicit, there is a pure primary language of humans, the language we use in our communication with gods, it's a poetic language, and the most important structural element of this language is that it's not explicit. It's based on hints, because poetic language is rich in metaphors and something like that. So I don't quite see that how you go further than Heidegger here, or further than Derrida, because again, I disagree strongly that what Derrida and Heidegger do is simply a reversal, a negation of the metaphysics of presence. So difference is not a negation or reversal. Difference is tertium non datur. It's it's element of exception, which cannot be constructed mechanically by applying by application some negations and so on. It's a creative work to come something like that, and from this, so as I see it, my point is that as I see it, actually you quite in agreement with Derrida and Heidegger, but you're insisting that you go further. So please, can you explain it a bit?
Whenever Heidegger talks about hints, he talks about them in terms of presence and absence. This is the ambiguity of being and the ambiguity of aletheia. Aletheia does not only mean unconcealment or revealing. It means revealing and concealing. Heidegger thinks presence and absence. He thinks the hint as presence and absence. He does not think.
Okay, and you just use a different term for it. It's implication.
It's not just a different term. This is my whole point. It's not just a different term, right? Tertium datur. There is a third, another way of being that is neither nor, neither present nor absent, nor some combination or permutation of the two.
It's difference. In Derrida's words, it's difference. Because this is
difference is a relation. Difference is a relation that is present and absent in differences. There is no thinking, as far as I can tell, in Derrida or in Heidegger, of this other way of being that is neither present nor absent, but always and everywhere presence and absence. Now, this is good. I'm not criticizing them for that. I think this constitutes a major advance in the history of philosophy. But I don't think it goes far enough. That's what I'm trying to do in Unity and Aspect.
Far enough where? Because your example, I'm sorry, probably I get it wrong, but I'm just relying on your examples for this very talk. One of your examples, which is commonly accessible to every one of us, is Russian language, where we don't have copula present.
Yeah.
It's not present, but it's not absent because it's implied. But how is this not the same as difference and not the same as poetic metaphors? Because actually you also listed some poetic poetic usages also in this enumeration.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, we would have to look at Derrida's discussion of différance, for example, in the text of différance, more closely. But I think what you'll find there is that différance is the relation between presence and absence that is itself present and absent. So what I don't see in Derrida is any tertium datur, any proshen that to which he could refer that could serve as the origin of presence and absence, that is neither one nor the other, out of which they both come. But I'm willing to say we need to look at the text, closely to determine that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, Andrew, thank you very much.
Sure.
So probably, so it's already, we are close to 2 hours of your talk, and I think it's appropriate time to wrap up. Thank you very much for
thank you for organizing this,
for giving this talk, and thank you for your kindness in answering all our questions. And so I look forward to asking more of my questions. Thank you.
my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all.